Pamela Turner, Editor-in-Chief of Slate. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Now, you have called Slate the old lady of the internet, given that she's over 20 years old now. That is a remarkably long time for a solely online publication. Just to give us an idea of, or to remind us of how old that is, what did Slate look like at the time? Did you, for example, have music? Is that right?
So Slate was founded by Michael Kinsley in 1996. He had funding from Microsoft, and part of the idea was like, let's figure out what journalism on the internet is going to be. It's this whole new platform. People are just beginning to get it in their homes. And he hired a team of print editors, because that's all there was at that point. And they made a bunch of assumptions about how people would read online that seem hilarious in retrospect. First, they had page numbers. There was a table of contents for the first issue, and you would click on page 26, and then something that was conceived of as page 26 would come up. Second, they published once a week. They thought the purpose of publishing online was, they thought of it as like a replacement for the mail system, not as a replacement for the pages of the magazine. So they published once a week and then assumed you would download it, print it out, and then read it on paper.
Probably quite a few people did print it out at the time, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, yes, there was music that played. That was sort of the bells and whistle. There was a song that would play when you tuned in. And
there was that notion of a fixed deadline, is that right? If it was published once a week? Yeah, they had a close, like a print magazine. These were before, they had abandoned all of these practices by the time I arrived at Slate in 2003, but I've heard the legends and lore. You came from a family that was rooted in a traditional journalistic background. I think your parents both worked at the Boston Globe, is that right? Yep. What attracted you to working for an online publication? You know, I was raised by journalists, but it wasn't the kind of household where they were like, "You're gonna where's your lead, kid? Like, you're gonna be a journalist or else." And I grew up thinking I was gonna be a lawyer or an architect or whatever else. But the truth of the matter is, there's just no better profession if you're a curious and verbal person. And I found myself editing my high school newspaper and my college newspaper, and then I found myself working in journalism professionally. And the thing that attracted me to Slate was actually not the fact of its being online, but the sensibility. I had been working for a few years at Time Inc., which publishes Time and People and is kind of the classic august magazine company in the States, on a couple magazines there with very smart, talented people, but there was always a sense that we were a bunch of smart magazine editors in New York, and we were imagining an audience that lived somewhere else in the plains of America, and we were trying to figure out where our interests and the interests of this perceived audience would intersect. And so it was this triangulation as part of the editorial process. And the thing that was clear about Slate from the very beginning was that the assumption was that the audience was just as smart as the people who made the magazine. And in fact, you know, that you're not smarter than other people because you're a journalist. You're just a smart person who happens to be a journalist. And there's other smart people out there who are doctors and lawyers and scientists and in government, and they don't have time to pursue their own curiosity, and you're doing it for them, but that they can keep up. And so the fact that Slate was general interest, that it had a sophisticated intellect, that it was witty and funny, and that it encouraged writers to really show their voices in their work, all really appealed to me. And then the fact that it was online kind of seemed like an afterthought. Like, okay, I guess I'd learn about that too. I think my parents were a little perplexed at the beginning, but they quickly figured it out. Did it have cred at the time, or was it seen as a sort of lesser to, you know, the august, you know, mastheads of the New York Times or, say, the Boston Globe? No, it's always had cred, I think, in large part because of the big cred, the credibility of our founder, Michael Kinsley, who's really just one of the great magazine brains of American journalism of all time. And so Slate was always considered the kind of savvy digital, I don't know, kid sister to the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or people knew it was a place that made smart things for smart people. So there was never disrespect, I think, or a sense that it was
a step down or anything like that.
What was your first gig there?
I had a few. I was just basically the assistant, but one column I wrote early on was called In Other Magazines. Slate did a lot of aggregation. It was sort of before we knew to call it aggregation, but in the early days we had a daily feature called Today's Papers that would write up what was on the front pages. I was going to say home pages, but they weren't home pages then. Front pages of the 5 big dailies in the States. We had a column called Summary Judgment that would review, sort of compile, here's a few different reviews, basically like an early Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes. And then In Other Magazines, just read, I think there was probably, 12 or 15 magazines we were expected to follow. And I would read them cover to cover every week and then do a little squib on the ones that had good stuff or bad stuff and say what was good or bad. But basically, what should you read in the stack that's piling up on your dining room table?
How revolutionary was that at the time, that approach?
I think we might have actually invented aggregation. We and some of the other publications that go back to the early internet all like to claim that we invented the voice of the internet. We invented this and we invented that, and we didn't quite invent slideshows, for better or for worse. Although I think we did invent a new way to use them. We were very early to link out to work on other sites, which seems so de rigueur now, but actually took a minute to figure out. But I think we might have actually invented aggregation. I think part of the appeal was the sense that our audience was smart, that they were media savvy, and that part of what they wanted Slate to do was collate and collect what was out there that was interesting, and then help them figure out what to think about it and which things were worth their time and attention.
I've heard you say in other interviews that you cringe a little bit at how kind of snarky you were as a 24-year-old, having a go at some of those publications, like, for instance, The New Yorker. How much was snark part of that internet sensibility back then, though?
Well, it's interesting. I got grilled by one particular interviewer for my snark as an early 20-something. I actually think I was very sincere, but Slate has always been a journal of opinion and commentary. And when I arrived there as a young woman in my early 20s, I was blown away by all of these august brains around me who could figure out what they thought about the budget or the scandal or the war or anything else in 3 hours and have a smart opinion about it on the internet. And I knew enough to know that I didn't have a ton of opinions about many world affairs as of yet, but I did have a lot of opinions about magazines. So the In Other Magazines gig was a good one for me. And I think I was a generous champion of excellent stories who was unafraid to be a little bit tart when called for, and it probably made the column better reading than it would have been if I had been all adulation. But that was an area I have thought about and loved magazines for a long time. So that was an area where, even as a young woman, I did have opinions.
What was your experience like of writing online as a young woman back then? We talk a lot about the dark side of the internet for some women who write online. Was the internet a friendlier place back then, do you think?
It was smaller, and the feedback wasn't as immediate. But I really just have never written about my personal life. And I think in a way I don't understand what it's like to be a woman on the internet in certain respects because of it. Like, I see what some of the women who write for Slate experience in their comments, also people of color, I should say, the kinds of ad hominem responses to work, whether it touches on their personal experience or not, when they're covering issues that draw on or use the perspective they bring, perhaps as a woman or person of color, people take it as license to be extremely crude and hostile and ad hominem in their tweets. And because I've mostly been an editor and edited more than written, maybe to the good, and also because as a writer I've written mostly about design, culture, sort of abstract topics that are distinct from politics, pretty distinct from my personal experience. I haven't experienced very much of it personally.
what do you think of that increasingly? I mean, it's attributed to the internet, but that increasing preponderance to write your own personal narrative through everything. A lot of online writers more and more thread that personal narrative through everything as opposed to the traditional journalistic approach.
Yeah. I mean, Slate really was a pioneer in making journalists sound like humans, without necessarily having the point of the journalism be to relate their own experience. So the example I always give there is Dahlia Lithwick, who's our Supreme Court correspondent, really revolutionized the way people think about and cover the Supreme Court. You know, these 9 judges who are the highest court in the land, whose decisions rule everything, were always treated as these kind of cloistered, unknowable Athenian minds. And she just went to their oral arguments and would describe them like she was describing a night at the theater, and describe what people's voices were like, what their manners were like, who was asking a ton of questions and which justices hung back and never spoke, and really helped. And she was funny. She would make jokes even when the arguments were about violence or were about incredibly arcane points of law. And she turned this very cloistered and very important part of American political life into like a lively tableau vivant where she was your interpreter and you really felt like you were spending time with a specific person in the company of this important body, and it helped you understand our laws and the direction of our country better than you would have otherwise. To me, what's crucial about the way she uses her voice is she's a specific human, she brings humor and insight, but what you come to her for is knowledge of something external to herself. She's using the fact of being a specific person as a way to engage you in understanding specific abstract and generalized topics. And I think there is a surfeit of personal writing on the internet. I think it's something that we haven't done very much of at Slate, but I think there has been more over the last 5 years than maybe over the last 20, an economy of personal revelation that does a disservice sometimes to young writers who get pulled into it.
How does it do a disservice, do you think?
Well, our culture editor, Laura Bennett, had a wonderful essay about this a few years ago, just pointing out that I think because of the dynamic of Facebook and what leads stories to be shared socially, a lot of young writers found that if they pitched an editor at an online outlet and they said, oh, I'd like to review a movie for you, or, you know, I have an interesting argument about the Supreme Court, who are they? But if they said, oh, well, you know, one time this truly garish thing happened to me when I was a child, or I experienced, you know, something awful, my cousin was murdered, I went through some particular bout of sexual violence, I've had this disease, I've had some specific, often lurid, painful experience, and I'm willing to write about it for you, online editor. The online editor can say, oh, wow, well, a lot of people would click on that.
Yeah.
People are curious to know what it's like to go through X or Y or Z horrible thing. And so a lot of young writers found that their first few clips were them as relatively inexperienced journalists and essayists kind of taking the most core and dense experiences they'd been through and using their fresh talents to mine them. And in general, online publications, I don't think this is true of Slate, but there can be less editing, there can be a little bit less support, less fact-checking. And so there was for a few years there, and Laura was very astute in pointing this out, just this glut of essays by very young women about very terrible things that had happened to them, some of which were extremely well written, some of which were leaning more on the experience maybe than the execution. And it wasn't, I don't think, a very good way for those women to enter journalism. I think we're moving away from that. Gia Tolentino had a very interesting essay in the New Yorker, who a terrific journalist who edited Jezebel, an online women's site in the States, saying that maybe that moment has come to an end. It was kind of a bookend to the essay that Laura wrote for us several years ago. Slate in general is much more about analysis and commentary than pure opinion. So it tends to bend the particular humanity of its writers more towards interpretation of the world than the relaying of specific personal experiences. So I don't think we got too caught up in that, but it definitely has been a trend online.
How do you define slatiness?
Oh, we know it when we see it. Slatiness is invariably smart and curious, but most journalists are, right? Or at least curious. And I think we have a reputation for being surprising or contrarian, for trying to find something new to say, for something unexpected to argue. And I think of that as being about really coming at all questions with an open mind and then trying to produce work that will change people's minds, either challenge a dearly held or widely held assumption or opinion, or just open people's minds up to some new framework for understanding the world.
Has that changed? Has that core changed over the years as platforms change, as modes of distribution change, or has it remained relatively true to that?
I think it's been pretty constant. I mean, one thing that Slate's learned being online for so long is that if you are a digital native, you are inevitably comfortable with change, right? There have been so many waves of the internet since Slate began. I don't even know what the one in the late 90s was. I was at home, writing English papers on my Mac SE. But there was sort of the SEO boom. There was the aggregation boom. There was the social boom. Now we're in the distributed content boom. I think we're kicking over into like a loyalty subscription boom, which is hopefully the most beautiful one yet. But part of what you need to do to navigate those moments, if you want longevity as a media brand, is figure out how the specific thing that you offer to your audience evolves to meet that particular moment. And I think different companies do that more and less well. And I also think, you can see there are new media ventures that have arisen with every boom. Facebook begets an Upworthy, the SEO era gets a Huffington Post. So Slate, I think, is among a smaller group of digital natives and having found a successful way to inhabit those different moments.
What about the audience? Has the audience changed over the years? And who is the Slate audience?
The audience has remained fairly constant over the years. They tend to be about 50-50 men and women, very educated, extremely likely to have postgraduate degrees. We index very high for that, relatively affluent, more geographically dispersed than, I think probably some people might call us the coastal elites, as we're referred to in the States. But actually we have readers quite broadly across the country and around the world. I think we're very big into podcasting at Slate. We have a number of podcasts, and our company's launched a whole podcast spin-off that helps other people make podcasts. And the podcast listenership is quite young, tends to be even a little bit younger than the digital readership, but otherwise the demographics overlap.
Because I imagine you have to be fairly egoless as an editor, but you do have an entirely other, well, maybe they're not separate, but you do have another fan base that has come to you through the Slate Culture Gabfest.
Yes.
And I've had a number of people who've seen you live this week say to me that they find it really, really weird to hear their friend's voice come out of your face. Is that a special, intimate relationship that you have with those listeners that differs to the rest of the Slate audience?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the Slate audience connects more with the Slate brand than with me as the editor-in-chief of Slate. But the podcast listening relationship is so powerful and intimate, and it never wigs me out when anybody says anything like that, because I'm an avid podcast listener. I was listening to a podcast on the way over here, and I have that relationship too. I have podcasters that I've met a couple times at events, but I don't really know them. But when I listen to the podcast, I'm always like, I want to tell John X, or I want to email Craig about X. And I'm like, I don't actually know them, really. It would be a little weird.
Do you get awkward around them?
No, but sometimes I do send them emails anyway, because for the ones I know a little bit. Because I have a podcast, I get to invite the podcasters I admire onto my podcast, and then I can meet them. But no, I mean, I think some of that relationship has to do with the nature of our show, which is a weekly conversation about culture, and it's very much like the conversation you would have with your friends after you all watched the same TV show or after you all went to see the same movie. What did it mean? What did you think about it? Wasn't this part funny? It really kind of made me think about the director's work. You know, it's a critical conversation, and you know, we try to be smart and insightful and funny, but it's like a book club, but for culture more broadly, and so people feel like they're part of it. And then podcasting, just the way you listen to it in your earbud, the way it follows you around. You know, I listen to podcasts in the shower at this point. I put my iPhone in a Ziploc bag.
Doesn't get more intimate than that, really.
Yeah, if I have to take a shower without listening to a podcast, I get so mad. Like, what a waste of a shower. Like if my husband's asleep or I don't have a Ziploc.
Okay,
yeah.
So try that.
You spend a lot of time with these people.
Is there a platform that you wouldn't try? For example, I saw you interview Elaine Welteroth, the editor of Teen Vogue. She's very big on Snapchat. I was watching her Snapchat after your interview, and it was incredibly comprehensive, and it made me feel very tired and made me feel a little bit like a nana. Is there a generational divide that we're seeing between audiences and the way that they consume media? Are there platforms that you feel like you don't need to be on, or do you still need to try everything?
Well, we don't have the resources to try every platform, so part of what we try to do is sort out which platforms seem conducive to the kind of work we do best. And we have not made huge inroads into Snapchat, in part because it's such a visual medium and tends to be a little bit quick. And we try to do work that allows for a lot of nuance, allows for a lot of complexity, and that's why podcasting has been so great for us, because you can really kind of dig in and do a fairly meaty conversation. In general, the generational question, I get very frustrated with the sites that claim to offer a millennial news product. I think they're all bullshit, basically.
How so?
Because if you look at the breakdown, the percentage of readers of Slate, the percentage of readers of Vox or Mike that are millennials, they're all actually quite similar. I think in any generation of news consumers, there are a set of people who want to get news in blobs of moving images that are fairly unsubtle and unnuanced, and maybe more and less politically biased, depending. And then there's a set of people who just want the kind of straight-ahead news report, and whether they're getting it in a sheaf of paper on their doorstep in the morning or it's just coming to them in text alerts on their phone, they just want just the facts, and that's what they're driven for. And then there's a set of people who seek out insightful commentary from sophisticated people pitched at a sophisticated level. Those people will exist in every generation. They will consume the news differently as time passes and as technology evolves. But if you can find those people and reach them, then you're getting the right crew. And I think we are finding the next generation of Slate consumers through podcasting. I don't think Snapchat is an incredibly useful vehicle for analysis and commentary yet.
Okay, good. I don't have to be on there. That's a really big relief. Back to podcasting for a minute. I think I read somewhere that you said you pursued podcasting for 6 years before you began to make any kind of a profit. And this is way before podcasting became the new next big thing yet again.
Yes.
What kept you at it?
So we began podcasting on kind of a lark. We had a partnership with a radio show with the public broadcasting radio company in the States, and it didn't pan out exactly, but we had this great radio producer on staff, and he said, you know what, podcasting is this thing. It's time shifting for audio. I'd like to try it. And our editor at the time said, great, go for it. And he was kind of off in a closet making recordings for like 6 months, and I don't think any of us even had the technology to download them or totally understood what he was doing. But eventually he cultivated this Gabfest format where 3 journalists sit around and have a conversation kind of like the ones journalists have with each other at the bar after the story's filed. And those conversations are always a little bit looser and a little bit more full of jokes and gossip, and they're fun. And he kind of had the idea of letting Slate audience eavesdrop on those conversations. And we could just tell that they were resonating with our audience, even though we hadn't found a great way to monetize them yet. And we probably did start pulling in ads maybe in the third, fourth, fifth years, but certainly we weren't breaking even. And as to why we stayed with it, I think part of it is that we just could tell the conversation was the kind of sophisticated, insightful analysis we wanted to do. The audiences we would find at live shows were hundreds of people who seemed like such avid understanders of the world, were counting on us to deliver this understanding. It felt like a level of engagement that was rare and unique, even on the internet where you publish and would hear back immediately from tens of dozens of people. It felt particularly passionate around these shows. And then some of it, I think, is just the realpolitik. For many years, our editor-in-chief, the fellow who preceded me, was the host of our politics show, and I was one of the hosts of the culture show as his number two, which I was before I took over a few years ago. So, like, the people in charge had podcasts, and we liked doing podcasts, so we kept doing podcasts. And so maybe it's just a happy accident of ego, but I think if we had been talking into the void and there was no reception there, they wouldn't have been fun and we wouldn't have kept doing them.
Another fascinating aspect of them, as you say, you tried to capture that feeling of eavesdropping on journos talking at a bar afterwards. There was a little bit of that feel in the Trump cast that you recorded in the hours after the world realised that this man was about to become president.
I'm so sorry.
It was...
Sorry we elected him.
You have a lot to answer for. That was fascinating listening because it sounded half like a therapy session and a soul-searching session.
Yeah.
How were you feeling at that point?
It was an awful, awful morning. I remain astonished that we elected him, but it really felt like a gut punch that morning, and also a really galvanizing moment in terms of what it means to be a journalist and how you cover this administration, how you interpret it for our audience. But that morning afterwards, I think we were just trying to understand what had happened and what it would mean. And I do think, I had a bunch of responses to it. You have a feeling of alienation from your country. Like, how could it be that so many people watched the same election I did and made the opposite choice? Which I'd felt before. I felt that in 2004 when Kerry lost and Bush was reelected. And it's like, did you see how he brought back torture? Like, what country do I live in? Who are my fellow countrymen? I was surprised by my response to Hillary's loss because I'm not her hugest fan, and I think she's such a specific person with such a long history, such a history of being loathed by so many, being the wife of a former president. She's not just our first woman candidate, first woman nominee from a major party in the States, but I was surprised that as a woman in charge, I felt her loss as a rejection of the idea of women in charge. Like, I've been very lucky to work at a place where my gender just isn't a factor in how I think about my work almost ever. And that morning I was like, oh, I'm quite sheltered. I think there was a real rejection of that notion. So it was a lot of reckoning. And then, of course, I was on the show that my boss did, Jacob Weisberg, the chairman of the Slate Group, as a lark. Oh, during the election, I'll do this Trump cast, and then he won't be the nominee, so I'll just do a pop-up podcast for a few months. And then, oh, well, I guess I'll extend it through November. And then we're like, okay, well, are you ready to do this podcast for 4 more years? So he's been very game, luckily.
Was there a moment in amongst all those very conflicting feelings that you thought, as editor-in-chief, this is good for us? No. It took a few weeks. I think it has been a really great moment for journalists because a lot of people are recognizing how important
good journalism is, both the investigative and the interpretive kind, and how much they value it. And we have seen the response in signups for our membership program, in our audience, and all of those things are great. But I would happily have taken the alternative election result without the boost to the membership program.
How big has the boost been?
Quite significant. We've nearly doubled what our membership was on election day. I'm trying to think if that's, we're not quite there, but almost a few thousand members away.
Would it be safe to say that not a lot of Trump supporters read Slate, and does that matter?
I think that a bunch of Trump supporters do, actually. One of our reporters, a terrific journalist called Henry Grabar, was relating the story of how he was doing a report on all the contractors in Texas who submitted bids to build the wall, between the states and Mexico. Very important wall. And he was reviewing the proposals, and he reached out to this Texan and said, "Hi, I'm Henry Grabar, I'm from Slate," and that the person said, "Oh, I love Slate, like that's one of my favorite places to read." And Henry was like, "Okay, I should warn you, I think I'm going to be pretty critical of these proposals and this whole idea of the wall." And he's like, "That's fine, I can take it." So I think actually we're pretty widely read. I think the challenge for us right now is that we are contrarian truth tellers, and we like to offer our readers sharp, accurate insights about the world, and also to be surprising. And there is much to interpret and much insight to excavate about the current moment, but not that much of it is that surprising. So the duty to tell the truth about this administration, its potential impact on Americans of all stripes, is higher than the duty to be surprising or, argue that up is down or black is white. And I think the thing we strive to do is come at our reporting with an open mind and show our work and be rigorous in how we arrive at the conclusions we arrive at. And probably our readership is more liberal than conservative, but I don't think of Slate as a partisan outlet.
How hard is it to try to find the way in when the pace at which developments are happening and the relentless nature of this administration thus far just keeps coming at you like a freight train? How do you navigate that?
It has been a total news onslaught. Our team is incredible. They've been working so hard. And the rhythm of journalism at a general interest site in the States tends to be a bit quadrennial, like you really sprint for the election, and then after the election you kind of pause and reset a little bit. And so we were working nights and traveling the country and throwing so many resources and then kind of assuming that, okay, great, and then in November Hillary will win and we'll let the culture team take over for a bit and the politics team will all go on vacation and then we'll kind of figure out what we want the balance of coverage to be in this new era. And we just went from one marathon immediately into a second marathon. It was like breaking through the tape and then having people be like, okay, 26.2 miles, go again. And it has been a lot. It's been really just a lot to take on. But I think people feel galvanized by the mission, by the tough moment that the country is in, and by the sense that there's a lot to learn and figure out about the world.
Is that an extra responsibility as editor-in-chief to kind of pull people along and keep them motivated, or do they just run on their own steam given the high stakes?
I think it's more my job to make sure people are taking care of themselves. People are motivated by the news, and that curiosity that drives our journalists is the power that keeps them after things and finding things out and figuring out how to understand things, and then just making sure that people, it's not a sprint, so you gotta make sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you can live to write another story the next day. I actually think is more the dynamic. Yeah.
one very different thing about the internet and the way we consume news as opposed to 20 years ago is the power of Facebook and Google. How do you try to ensure that you don't cede too much power to an outlet like Facebook, or is that virtually impossible?
Well, I think it's like managing a stock portfolio. You got to diversify your bets, right? And this is, again, I think where it's useful to be a publication that's been around for a long time and has a purpose beyond exploiting what a particular platform is doing at a particular moment, because you have a relationship with your audience that transcends any specific platform. So, Facebook has become such an important driver, and that relationship is important and fraught, and all of the different journalists have their tales of joy and woe with that platform. And Facebook, I think, is currently in a moment of aggressive courting of journalists, which we'll see how long that lasts. But so many cocktail gatherings and fact-finding sessions,
Right.
and if we could get them to give us some money, that would be useful. But in general, Facebook has been much more of a boon for journalists than it has been a problem, in that the degree to which it has fostered the discovery of news outlets by massive, massive audience of people has been great. I mean, the whole content boom that we're living through in the States, all of these new companies powered by venture capital, trying to build media brands that attract audiences, that's all thanks to Facebook and the fact that for a few years there it was very easy to build large audiences fast. It is now no longer that easy, and for the companies that have a specific enough vision of what they do and who they're talking to, on to the next. And for those that were hoping that specific media moment where distribution was free would continue forever, too bad.
So does your subscription model protect you from the vagaries of the Facebook algorithm to some extent?
I think so. I mean, in general, we are moving towards a loyalty strategy. I think for too long, journalists, and particularly in the Facebook era, journalists were concerned with scale and how many monthly unique visitors your site got. And that is a measure of something, but those people who come to your site once and bounce away because they saw a Facebook link, they don't really know who your site is, they don't know what you do, and they're not actually that valuable in the end, apart from being a number that you can put on a slide in a deck to show to an advertiser and hopefully sell ads to. So we've moved towards a loyalty focus where we're trying to really use data to understand who comes to Slate, who values us the most, how we can get them to come back more often, how we can get them to come back more often in a way that leads them to become members eventually. And we still need those. It's still better when a lot of people come to the site in a given month. Those are leads and people who could eventually move down the funnel and become people who pay for Slate. But we're thinking more about what do we show those people? How do we teach them what Slate is? How do we describe our work to them so that when they do come to Slate once, they get oriented and they get pointed towards understanding our brand, understanding who we are, understanding what we do.
In the days after Trump's election, Mark Zuckerberg sort of shrugged his shoulders around Facebook's, any kind of responsibility that Facebook may have played around Trump's election. He then changed his tone, and you mentioned the fact that they're courting journalists at the moment. Do you think they should be taking on some notion of editorial responsibility?
I think it depends what the problem is you're talking about. So there was a lot of talk after the election about fake news and the spread of fake news, and in the context of a Facebook Instant article, does a story that's fake have any more or less authority than a story that's been fully vetted by a responsible outlet? I essentially think that fake news is a bit of a red herring in understanding the election result, and is not something that Facebook should be. I mean, but it sounds worth improving, and I think there's great stories if you look at the history of Google and search results, like these platforms do have a power to signal the value of the things they point to. And Facebook has evolved over time in trying to measure how much time people spend on a story before they share it. Like, is it clickbait or is there something satisfying behind the headline? They should continue to tinker with that and try to make sure that the things that go viral are not things that are insane bullshit. Yes. But I don't think Facebook and fake news had a huge effect on the election. I think the thing that it would be great for Facebook to think more seriously about, and that they are making some promising noises about, is just how Facebook fits into the funding of journalism. Because the advertising revenues that you get for articles that are on their platform and instant articles are not as high as you can get when you have them on your own platforms. And they don't yet have a great way to work with subscription partners that have a subscription model, and they really need to develop one so that when you become exposed to an outlet on Facebook, you have a way to then become a loyalist of that outlet more easily than you currently do. So I think what's really important is how they can help drive the economic sustainability of journalism rather than the content of it.
What does Slate look like in 5 years' time?
That's such a good question. You're assuming we still have a world. I mean, honestly, I think in the internet you kind of have to think in spans of 18 months. So, 5 years is nearly 4 18 months. No, that's wrong. It's 3.
Is it impossible to predict that far ahead?
I kind of think it is. I think it's actually unwise to make a 5-year plan on the internet. I think you need to be aware of what's percolating. And so big things that are percolating, the newsrooms are currently investigating how much to invest in. There's the Snapchat question you asked. There's the rise of VR and the question of whether virtual reality is going to become a primary platform and a place where journalists need to live and be. There is the incredible emphasis on video as the prime medium, and the constant hand-wringing about whether text is dead, which it just isn't. It is a much more information-dense conveyance for meaning and will continue to have value no matter how used we get to video. Video is also great and will be great, but text will never die. You heard it here first. But how to invest in video and how much to invest in video is a constant question. And then the continuing rise of mobile, of distributed platforms. I mean, all of these forces will merge. I think actually one of the most underrated and most significant media changes is going to be the things like the Amazon Alexa, using, like, talking to devices and telling them to deliver you media. Because in some ways, voice is going to become a new proxy for search, right? So instead of typing in, like I just had a classic great Google experience here in Australia where I was trying to figure out how the latitudes of Australian cities correspond to the latitudes of North American cities above the equator. Like, is Melbourne New York? Is Melbourne San Francisco? Like, trying to figure it out. And I Googled, I forget what the exact string was, but it was just like, I've learned Google, right? It was like, latitudes, Australian and North American cities relative to equator. And I got some Reddit post where some person had transposed Australia upside down on top of North America, and it was all laid out. It was like one click.
Beautiful Googling. Beautiful.
Perfect, right? But now you're going to talk to somebody. You're going to talk to your little robot pal and get her to do that for you. And that is going to completely change the way that we tag and label and promote and distribute everything we make. But that's probably just the next 18 months. And then they'll be like, I don't know, we'll be taken over by aliens, or we'll all be reading on like e-ink screens. I mean, you can only look so far ahead. And I think the key thing to do for media brands is to just understand, like, what is the core thing that your audience is coming to you for, and what are the tools available at the moment that will allow you to meet that need, and then use them as creatively and inventively as you can.
One last question. Of those tools that we know exist at the moment or on the cards, what excites you the most and what scares you the most?
Well, I'm excited about voice as a replacement for search. I don't quite know what it's going to be yet, but given our strength in audio and the strength of our podcasts and the fact that in general Slate has a conversational voice, the notion that you would talk to a device and part of what would come back to you would be Slate, I think is going to be really neat to investigate. I do think video is challenging because I think people misunderstand what's valuable about it. And a lot of media companies are chasing video heedlessly in a way that will not be good for them or for their audiences. And so I'd say we've been working to find a smarter way to develop our video voice, but I think the kind of the death of text has been extremely exaggerated and people shouldn't overplay it.
Thank you very much, Julia, for talking to us today.
Thank you. This has been incredibly fun.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.